Bernie Sanders had never been one to hold his tongue. Over the years, he had carved out a reputation as the uncompromising voice of the working class, a man who could look into the camera and call out billionaires, lobbyists, and presidents without blinking. But on that particular night, during a live panel discussion hosted on national television, Sanders seemed to forget one crucial thing. Not every punch lands. The Way You Think It Will, *, the segment, was focused on post-midterm fallout, with a panel of guests discussing what the results meant for both parties. As expected, the conversation drifted toward Donald Trump. While some panelists chose to weigh in with the usual cautious language, Bernie was different. His disdain for Trump had always been public, but this time it wasn't policy critiques or economic analysis, it was personal. As the cameras zoomed in, he leaned toward the microphone and, with the conviction of a preacher delivering final judgment, said, "Donald Trump is not just a pathological liar. He's a con man who has betrayed every working-class American who ever believed in him." The studio audience, predictably progressive, broke into applause. The moment went viral within minutes, clipped and shared on social media with captions like "Bernie tells it like it is." Pundits on left-leaning outlets praised him for having the guts to say what others only hint at. But while Sanders was being celebrated online, something very different was happening behind the scenes. Trump didn't respond, not immediately. There was no flurry of late-night social media posts, no rapid-fire response via video or press release. For 3 full days, he was uncharacteristically silent. It was enough for many in the media to assume that Bernie had scored a rare, unanswered blow. Some even speculated that Trump was finally too rattled to engage. What they didn't know was that Trump wasn't ignoring the insult. He was preparing a response. Not a rant, not a comeback tweet, but something far more calculated. Meanwhile, Bernie continued his media rounds, repeating the same line in interviews and speeches. He framed Trump as an enemy of the working class, invoking images of corruption and deception. He doubled down, framing his insult not just as a statement, but as a moral obligation. For his loyal supporters, it felt like vintage Bernie raw, unfiltered truth, but even as he rode the temporary wave of approval, some with his aides grew uneasy. There were whispers that Trump was going to address Bernie directly at his upcoming rally in Pennsylvania. And unlike typical rallies, this one was being billed with unusual secrecy. No leaks, no previews, just one promise. Trump had something to say that the American people deserved to hear. Bernie, either undeterred or unaware of what was coming, stayed on message. To him, this was just another round in a political war he'd been fighting for decades. Trump was the easy villain in his narrative, a man who represented everything Bernie had spent his life opposing. But that miscalculation treating Trump as a predictable opponent would cost him. Trump had always been a showman, but this time he acted like a prosecutor. Instead of launching into hyperbole, he walked the crowd through a detailed breakdown of Sanders' past positions, business dealings, and campaign decisions. He exposed contradictions that even some of Sanders' own followers hadn't paid attention to, moments where Bernie said one thing and did another. He questioned Sanders' hiring of corporate-linked consultants, showing documents and contracts on screen. He played clips of Sanders, praising policies in undemocratic countries that didn't align with his current stances. And most damningly, he paused at one point and said, "Bernie Sanders says I betrayed working-class Americans, but Bernie sold them an idea he never intended to live by. That's not just betrayal, it's fraud, wrapped in virtue." That line stuck. It didn't sound like Trump's usual bombast. It was sharp, focused, and heavy with implication. Bernie, who had spent decades building his image as an unwavering, honest populist, suddenly found himself questioned not by his usual critics, but by people who had admired him. The insult he threw at Trump, meant to ignite his base, had instead triggered a backlash he wasn't ready for. In trying to brand Trump a con man on live TV, he had opened a door that Trump walked through with, receipts in hand. Donald Trump's usual response to an attack is swift and blunt. But after Bernie Sanders publicly labeled him a pathological liar and a con man who had betrayed working-class Americans on live TV, Trump chose a path that surprised even his closest advisors. He said nothing. No Truth Social post, no off-the-cuff remark at a press event, not even a casual swipe at a rally. For 3 full days, the man known for his immediate and often unfiltered reactions went completely silent. Many in the media interpreted Trump's quiet as defeat or perhaps uncertainty. Analysts on progressive networks speculated that Sanders' bold words had finally rattled him. But those who had worked closely with Trump during his political ascent knew better. Silence wasn't a sign of retreat, was the calm before the storm. Behind the scenes, Trump was building something. He wasn't interested in tossing insults back at Sanders. He wanted to dismantle him. Word eventually leaked that Trump's next rally in Scranton, Pennsylvania would be different, aides hinted. It would include substance, not just slogans. And the decision to hold it in Scranton, the symbolic hometown of Joe Biden and a working-class stronghold, wasn't random. Trump wanted a stage that reinforced the exact demographic Bernie claimed he was defending when the day came. The crowd was electric, but Trump was uncharacteristically restrained. Instead of opening with his usual fiery tone, he walked slowly to the podium with a black folder in hand. There was no red meat rhetoric, no exaggerated claims. What came next was a methodical, almost prosecutorial breakdown of Bernie Sanders and the narrative he had spent decades constructing. Trump began by playing clips reel, unedited archival footage of Sanders speaking favorably about aspects of authoritarian governments during the 1980s. Statements that sounded dramatically out of step with his current messaging. Then came the revelation that Sanders had actively opposed a low-income housing project in Vermont during his tenure as mayor. An odd position for someone who now champions housing as a human right, but it was the next segment that delivered. The biggest blow, Trump unveiled a collection of financial disclosures and political contracts, showing that Sanders had used several consulting firms during his 2020 campaign that he had previously denounced as tools of corporate greed. He listed names, showed billing records, and displayed quotes from Bernie criticizing these very same firms just a few years earlier. The contradictions weren't vague. They were laid out, line by line, dollar by dollar. He didn't scream. He didn't boast. He spoke with precision, each fact designed to undermine Sanders' most valuable asset, his perceived integrity. Then, pausing for effect, he looked straight into the camera and said, "Bernie doesn't lie with his words, he lies with his actions. And the American people are smart enough to know the difference." It wasn't a typical Trump performance, and that's what made it hit harder. It wasn't about dominating the headlines for shock value. It was about control, credibility, and a narrative that was now turning. The audience in Scranton didn't just cheer, they leaned in, as if watching something serious unfold. In political circles, the effect was immediate. News outlets that typically dismissed Trump's claims started fact-checking Sanders' records. Surprisingly, much of it held up. The footage was authentic, the documents verifiable. Even commentators on neutral platforms began to raise questions. Was Bernie Sanders as ideologically pure as he claimed? Had he, over time, compromised the values he built his career on? While Trump's opponents tried to dismiss the rally as another stunt, they couldn't ignore the shift in tone. For once, Trump had played the long game. By refusing to meet Bernie's insult with another insult, he flipped the dynamic. Instead of appearing petty or reactive, he came off as prepared, focused, and, for a change, backed by facts that spoke, louder than his usual bravado. Bernie, for all his passion and conviction, hadn't anticipated this kind of response. He had thought Trump would come out swinging with insults and childish jabs. Instead, Trump delivered a quiet, cutting rebuttal that left Sanders exposed in a way he wasn't ready for. And as clips from the Scranton rally began circulating online, a new narrative took shape, one where Bernie's most vocal insult became the spark that triggered a calculated counterattack unlike anything Trump had done before. When Donald Trump walked off the stage in Scranton, the reaction wasn't just loud, it was seismic. Within minutes, his methodical takedown of Bernie Sanders had exploded across every platform. But it wasn't the usual MAGA crowd doing the heavy lifting. This time, the clips of Trump calmly dissecting Bernie's contradictions were being watched and shared by independents, swing voters, and even disillusioned progressives who weren't known for echoing Trump's message. The public reaction didn't follow the expected script, and for Bernie, that shift was both sudden and disorienting. Asterisk, the core of Trump's speech had been simple. Bernie Sanders had sold himself for decades as a working-class champion who stood alone against corporate power. But now, Trump was offering a counter-narrative, one grounded in documented inconsistencies, financial disclosures, and historical video clips that contradicted Bernie's carefully constructed image. And people listened, asterisk, in the hours after the speech. Some of the internet's most influential political commentators, many who had previously criticized Trump, began raising uncomfortable questions. One thread that went viral came from a self-described Democratic socialist who had volunteered for Sanders' campaign in 2020. In it, he wrote, "I never thought I'd say this, but Trump's right about one thing. Bernie's campaign used firms he told us to hate. We all looked the other way. Maybe we shouldn't have." Asterisk, it wasn't a mass defection, but it was a significant crack in the wall. Media outlets that typically avoided covering Trump's speeches in detail found themselves forced to fact-check his claims. And what surprised many was how accurate the information turned out to be. The consulting firms Bernie had labeled as corrupt were indeed listed in his campaign filings. The clip of him praising Nicaragua's government back in the 80s hadn't been edited or distorted. It was real, and the context only made it worse. And his opposition to a housing project in Vermont, long buried in local politics, was now front-page news. Asterisk, it wasn't just the right-wing media amplifying it. Center-left publications, caught between defending Bernie and acknowledging the documents, found themselves hedging. Headlines like Trump's Sanders claims, distorted or disturbingly accurate, began popping up. Even CNN ran a segment titled, "Is Bernie's brand as clean as we thought?" Asterisk, as the public digested the information, the tone on social media shifted. Memes that once mocked Trump began showing Bernie's face beside headlines about hypocrisy. Longtime Sanders supporters flooded Reddit threads with frustration, not because they were turning on him, but because they felt caught off guard. They had believed in the idea of Bernie as someone untouchable by the usual political rot. Trump, somehow, had pierced that armor. Asterisk, and perhaps most significantly, the generational base Bernie depended on, young voters, started asking different kinds of questions. TikTok videos emerged, not mocking Trump, but scrutinizing Bernie's financial rise since entering national politics. "I thought he didn't have a millionaire bone in his body." One influencer questioned, quoting Bernie's own words, before showing a breakdown of his book deals and real estate holdings. Asterisk, Trump, known for his scorched earth approach, had opted for something more surgical, and it worked. Instead of drawing attention to himself with outlandish claims, he focused the spotlight on Bernie's actions and let the contrast speak for itself. That restraint made the content more palatable for audiences who usually tuned Trump out. For once, they weren't distracted by the messenger. They were listening to the message, and the message landed. Polls taken just days after the rally showed a noticeable dip in Sanders' favorability among independent voters. A particularly telling focus group conducted in Wisconsin revealed that while most participants still disliked Trump, a majority agreed with the statement. Bernie Sanders is not as consistent as he claims to be. It was a small shift, but in a tight political landscape, perception can outweigh allegiance. Asterisk, Trump didn't gloat publicly. Instead, he let the story run its course. That silence added to the sense that this wasn't just a political win, it was a psychological one. For a man often accused of never having a plan, Trump's calculated patience delivered a rare kind of blow, one that didn't just sting in the moment, but continued to unravel Bernie's image in the minds of voters who once saw him as a symbol of moral clarity. Bernie Sanders had been through political storms before, but nothing quite like this. In his long career, he'd built a brand rooted in consistency, principle, and defiance. He prided himself on standing firm when others wavered, refusing to sell out even when it cost him politically. But after Donald Trump's calm, fact-laced takedown at the Scranton rally, Sanders faced a new kind of challenge, one that didn't come from a clash of ideology, but from a blow to his credibility. And this time, the damage was coming from within the very coalition that once treated him as untouchable. Asterisk, in the immediate aftermath of Trump's speech, Bernie's team scrambled. They had anticipated some response to the TV insult, but no one expected Trump to be so calculated, so deliberate, and most critically so prepared. When Sanders stepped onto a different network just days later to address the fallout, he was noticeably less animated. His voice carried the usual passion, but the confidence was less sharp, his answers more cautious. The anchor, known for being sympathetic to Bernie in the past, didn't shy away. "It's Senator," she asked. "Trump laid out campaign records showing you used firms you previously criticized. Were those records inaccurate?" Bernie didn't directly answer. Instead, he shifted to talking about Medicare for all and wealth inequality. It was his comfort zone. But this time, the deflection didn't work. The follow-up question was sharper. "With respect, Senator, if you're going to criticize others for being in bed with corporate interests, how do you justify using the same consulting firms you've spoken out against?" Bernie paused. Then came a response that left even some longtime supporters disappointed. "In a national campaign, sometimes decisions are made that aren't perfect," he said. "But the broader fight remains the same." That line was. All critics needed. Social media lit up with reactions, not from conservatives, but from frustrated progressives who felt betrayed. "Not perfect" sounded far too similar to the establishment excuses Bernie had built his career attacking, and as more clips from Trump's speech resurfaced, even people who once defended Sanders began revisiting his past with new eyes. The most troubling part wasn't that Bernie had made compromises. It was that he had been caught making them by someone his base considered morally bankrupt. That role reversal's Trump playing the exposer. Sanders on the defensive was difficult for many progressives to digest. Inside Bernie's camp, the tension was palpable. Advisors began pushing for a stronger counteroffensive, but every attempt at pivoting only made the situation murkier. A new interview on a progressive podcast meant to clear the air ended up fanning the flames. When asked directly about the real estate holdings Trump referenced properties that placed Bernie in the millionaire class he once claimed to oppose, he responded by saying he wrote a best-selling book, and that's what happens in America. It was a line he had used before, but in this new context, it felt hollow. Meanwhile, Trump remained quiet, a strategy that added to Sanders' discomfort. With no new statements from Trump to push back against, Bernie was left responding to a single rally speech that continued to echo louder with each passing day. That silence, whether intentional or strategic, made it harder for Sanders to regain control of the narrative. Support from prominent progressive figures also began to waver. A few avoided commenting altogether. One, a rising Democratic congresswoman closely aligned with Bernie during the 2020 campaign, was asked whether she still viewed him as above reproach. She replied carefully, "I believe in the movement more than any one person." For Bernie, who had once been the movement, that was a quiet blow. Think pieces began appearing in places that had previously lionized him. One headline in a major publication read, "Did we ignore the flaws in Bernie Sanders too long?" The article didn't trash him, it acknowledged his impact, but it asked hard questions about whether idealism had blinded supporters to contradictions. That Trump, ironically, had been the first to lay bare so publicly. The final sign of the shift came in a poll conducted among Democratic primary voters under 35, a group once overwhelmingly loyal to Sanders. While he still held support, the number of those who said they completely trust Bernie Sanders to stand by his values had dropped by double digits. Trump hadn't just rebutted a personal insult, he had cracked open a long-sealed door into Bernie's past decisions, and the backlash wasn't coming from MAGA world, it was coming from Bernie's own. As the dust began to settle, it became clear that the aftermath of Bernie Sanders' televised insult and Donald Trump's uncharacteristically restrained response had altered more than just the trajectory of a news cycle. It had fundamentally shifted the political perception of two men who had long been caricatured by their extremes. For years, Sanders had occupied a space in American politics that seemed almost immune to scrutiny from the right. His followers saw him as the last honest man in Washington, someone who had never bowed to corporate pressure or political convenience. But Trump's speech in Scranton shattered that illusion for many. What made Trump's counter so effective wasn't its volume, but its substance. He didn't meet Bernie's insult with another insult. He met it with evidence. He didn't rely on bravado, but instead pulled together verifiable records, public contradictions, and clips from Bernie's past to quietly flip the narrative. And by doing so, he reintroduced himself to a portion of the American public not as a loud disruptor, but as someone capable when he chose to weaponize facts with surgical precision. Asterisk for Sanders. The fallout was deeply personal. He hadn't just taken a political hit, he'd taken a reputational one. The foundations of his appeal had always been moral authority, consistency, and ideological purity. Once cracks appeared in that foundation, even loyal followers were forced to reassess what they believed about him. Trump hadn't converted them, but he had introduced just enough doubt to make them hesitate. And in politics, hesitation is often the beginning of decline. Asterisk, what made this clash even more striking was that it came not during a heated election cycle, but in a moment when both men were vying more for influence than for votes. Sanders' attempt to frame Trump as a betrayer of the working class had been a calculated strike. But in launching that attack without anticipating a strategic response, he misjudged both the moment and the man. Trump, ever the showman, used patience and timing to deliver a response that changed the narrative on his terms. Asterisk, in the end, it wasn't just about who insulted who. It was about the deeper question of authenticity. Who truly stood for what they claimed? Bernie, for all his years of messaging, had left a trail of contradictions that were easy to overlook until someone forced them into the spotlight. Trump, by choosing a moment of clarity over chaos, proved that political combat doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes, all it takes is waiting for your opponent to open a door and walking through it with receipts in hand. Asterisk, that single exchange reshaped more than just two legacies. It reminded the country that in the age of endless noise, silence followed by precision can cut the deepest.